There is a strange moment in the awakening process, a moment that almost no one talks about. It is not the moment of joy. It is not the moment of enlightenment. It is not when everything suddenly makes sense. In fact, it is a quiet moment, almost invisible, a moment when something inside you simply stops. And when that happens, the first feeling can be confusing. You begin noticing something unusual happening inside your mind. The same problems still exist. Life continues unfolding. People are still around you. But something changed, and a question slowly begins to appear. Why does this no longer affect me the same way? Maybe you have experienced this during an ordinary moment. A situation that once triggered anxiety, anger, or worry suddenly no longer creates the same reaction. Not because you became indifferent, not because you stopped caring about life, but because something inside you started noticing something different. A quiet distance. As if you were observing your own mind instead of being trapped inside it. And when this happens, a very unusual feeling begins to emerge. A calm, but it is not an ordinary calm. It is not the calm that comes after solving a problem. It is not the calm after achieving something. It is not the calm that comes after finally getting what you wanted. It is a different kind of calm. A strange calm. A calm that appears when the mind begins realizing something fundamental. That may be, much of the struggle you carried throughout your entire life was never truly necessary, and that realization can feel unsettling. Because for years, maybe for decades, the mind believed that struggle was essential. Struggle to achieve, struggle to prove, struggle to improve, struggle to become enough, struggle to control the future, struggle to avoid mistakes, struggle to guarantee safety. But slowly, awakening begins revealing something unexpected. Maybe most of that struggle was created by the mind itself. Maybe the mind was constantly trying to reorganize a reality that never needed to be reorganized. Maybe the mind was trying to control something that was never meant to be controlled. And when this realization begins to appear, something very interesting happens. The mind begins slowing down, not because you forced it to stop, but because the mind itself begins noticing how exhausted it has become. Exhausted from trying to predict everything, exhausted from trying to solve everything, exhausted from trying to prevent everything, exhausted from trying to control everything. And when that mental exhaustion finally meets a moment of silence, a new experience begins to appear. A space between one thought and another, a space between one reaction and another, a space between one impulse and another. And inside that space, something unexpected emerges, a silent peace, not the peace of perfection, but the peace of non-resistance. And this peace has something very unusual about it. It does not announce itself. It does not create excitement. It does not demand attention. It simply appears, as if it had always been there, waiting for the mind to become quiet enough to notice it. And once you begin feeling this, even for brief moments, something inside you begins asking a deeper question. What if the mind was never meant to fight life? What if the mind was meant only to witness it? That question changes everything. Because if the mind does not need to fight life, then maybe much of the suffering we carry does not come from life itself, but from the constant resistance the mind creates against what is already happening. And when this understanding begins to unfold, even slowly, a new kind of silence begins to appear. An inner silence. A silence that does not depend on controlling the world. A silence that does not depend on fixing every problem. A silence that emerges when the mind finally realizes something simple. That perhaps, life was never the enemy. And when that realization begins to mature, a very unusual peace begins to appear. A peace many people describe as strange, because it does not arrive with explanations. It simply appears when the mind stops fighting. And that raises a very important question, a question very few people ever ask. If peace appears when the mind stops fighting, why has the mind spent so much time fighting? And that question is exactly what we are about to explore. When that strange peace begins to appear, the mind almost always reacts. Because the mind is not used to silence, it is used to movement, it is used to problems, it is used to the feeling that something always needs to be fixed. Throughout most of our lives, the mind has been trained to fight. Fight circumstances, fight mistakes, fight the past, fight the future, fight what people think, fight the possibility of failure, and above all, fight the present moment. This may sound unusual when you first hear it, but take a moment and observe your own mind. How many times a day does the mind say something like, "This shouldn't be happening, this should be different, this wasn't supposed to happen, this needs to change"? These thoughts seem harmless, but they reveal something very profound. They reveal resistance, a constant resistance against what is already happening, and this resistance creates something that many people mistake for reality: suffering. because psychological suffering rarely comes only from circumstances. It comes from the conflict between reality and the story the mind creates about how reality should be. When awakening begins, this mechanism starts becoming visible. Before awakening, the mind reacted automatically. A thought appeared, and you immediately believed it. An emotion appeared, and you immediately became that emotion. But when awareness begins to awaken, something changes. You begin noticing the thought before becoming the thought. You begin noticing the emotion before being carried away by it. And within that small space of observation, something extraordinary happens. You begin realizing that many thoughts are simply attempts by the mind to resist reality. And this realization can feel uncomfortable, because it reveals something the mind rarely wants to admit, that much of the struggle we carry does not come from life itself, but from the interpretation the mind creates about life. The mind generates narratives, stories, projections, worries, and then reacts to those narratives as if they were facts. This creates an almost invisible cycle, a cycle that begins with a thought. The thought creates an emotion, the emotion reinforces the thought, and the thought strengthens the emotion. And so the mind remains trapped in a continuous movement of resistance. Resistance to the present, resistance to uncertainty, resistance to impermanence. But when awakening begins to deepen, something interrupts this cycle. It is not a technique, it is not effort, it is not a strategy to control the mind. It is something much simpler, observation. You begin noticing that the mind is fighting, and when you notice that, something interesting happens. The struggle begins losing strength, because the mind's struggle depends on something essential: identification. Maybe the mind was never the real problem. The real problem was believing that every thought was absolute truth. And when that understanding begins to emerge, the mind naturally starts relaxing. And when the mind relaxes, something that has always been present begins to appear: silence, an inner silence, a silence that does not depend on external conditions, a silence that exists even while life continues unfolding. And that silence reveals something many people only discover after awakening. The peace we spent our lives searching for outside may have always existed inside, hidden behind layers of thought, layers of resistance, layers of fear, layers of control. And as those layers begin dissolving, the mind begins experiencing something entirely new, not the absence of thoughts, but the absence of conflict with thoughts. And that changes everything, because when the mind stops fighting the present moment, life begins to feel different, lighter, simpler, quieter. But this leads to an even deeper question. If peace appears when the mind stops fighting, why did the mind learn to fight so much? Where does this constant impulse to control come from? Where does this deep resistance to what is happening originate? And when we begin exploring that question, we discover something even more fascinating. The mind does not fight because it wants to, it fights because it believes it must. And understanding why the mind believes this is exactly what we will explore next. When we begin observing this constant impulse of the mind to fight reality, an inevitable question arises. Why does the mind do this? Why does it react with so much resistance to the present moment? If peace appears when the mind stops fighting, why does the mind seem programmed to do the opposite? To understand this, we need to look at the mind differently, not as an enemy, but as an ancient mechanism. A mechanism shaped by thousands of years of survival. For most of human history, the mind was never trained to find peace. It was trained to detect danger. It was trained to anticipate threats. It was trained to identify problems before they even appeared. This kind of mind was incredibly useful for survival. Imagine an early human walking through a forest. If that person was not constantly alert to what could go wrong, survival would be unlikely. So the mind evolved with a very specific tendency. It became highly skilled at detecting risks, highly skilled at predicting negative scenarios, highly skilled at imagining problems that may not even exist. This mechanism helped our ancestors survive, but in the modern world, that same mechanism began creating a very curious phenomenon. The mind continues searching for danger. Even when no real danger exists, it continues anticipating problems. Even when nothing is happening, it continues fighting imagined scenarios, and the result of this is a constant state of mental tension, a feeling that something is always wrong, something always needs to be fixed, something always needs to be improved. But when awareness begins awakening, this mechanism becomes visible. You begin noticing that the mind is constantly trying to predict the future, constantly trying to avoid discomfort, constantly trying to control things that have not even happened yet. And when you observe this deeply, something interesting begins to happen. You realize that much of mental activity is not connected to the present moment. It is connected to projections. Projections about the future, interpretations of the past, simulations of scenarios that may never occur. And the more the mind becomes absorbed in those imagined scenarios, the further it moves away from direct experience. The mind begins living inside a psychological space, a space made of thoughts, concerns, memories, expectations. Meanwhile, life continues unfolding here, now, in this moment, and when that difference becomes clear, something very important begins to happen. You begin realizing that the mind is not fighting life. It is fighting the idea the mind created about how life should be. This is an extremely profound insight, because it reveals something many people live their entire lives without seeing. The mind rarely fights reality. It fights the gap between reality and expectation. When that gap appears, the mind reacts. It resists. It tries to correct. It tries to control. But when you begin observing this movement, without fully identifying with it, something new becomes possible. You begin noticing that thoughts may still appear, but you no longer need to fight every thought. And when that happens, the energy that once fueled the struggle begins dissolving. The mind still speaks. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer dominate the experience. They move, like waves, like clouds, like temporary echoes, and in the space between those thoughts, that strange peace becomes more present, a peace that does not come from perfect circumstances, but from the absence of conflict with life. And as this peace deepens, something even more surprising begins emerging. A new relationship with silence. A silence that once felt empty now begins to feel alive. A silence that once felt like absence now begins to feel like presence. But this silence can also bring a new question. A question many people encountered during this phase of awakening. If the mind stops fighting, who am I without that struggle? If the mind stops reacting constantly, what remains of my identity? And that question opens the door to an even deeper transformation. Because when the mind stops fighting life, it begins discovering something that was always hidden behind the noise: consciousness. When the mind begins realizing it does not need to fight every thought, something very curious starts happening. The external life may remain exactly the same. Circumstances may not have changed. Challenges may still exist. But the inner experience begins transforming. Because something that once seemed impossible begins to occur. You start experiencing moments of inner silence. Moments when the mind is not trying to control anything. Moments when the mind is not trying to correct anything. Moments when there is simply presence. And in those moments, a very unusual feeling appears. A calm. But it is not a calm created by effort. It is not a calm produced by techniques. It is not a calm that comes because every problem has been solved. It is a calm that appears when the mind finally realizes something essential, that fighting every thought, every emotion, every situation in life, never created the peace it was searching for years, perhaps for an entire lifetime. The mind believed that peace would be the result of control. Control of the future, control of circumstances, control of people, control of emotions. But slowly, awakening begins revealing something different. Perhaps peace was never the result of control. Perhaps peace is the result of the absence of control. This may feel paradoxical at first, because the mind has been conditioned to believe that control means safety, that prediction means protection, that planning means stability. But when awareness begins expanding, you start noticing something very interesting. Much of mental tension comes from the constant attempt to control what cannot be controlled. Control time. Control other people's behavior, control outcomes, control how life unfolds. And when that attempt inevitably fails, as it often does, the mind reacts. Frustration appears, anxiety appears, worry appears. But when you begin observing this mechanism, something inside you starts relaxing, because you realize the mind has been trying to solve a problem that never truly existed. Life never demanded absolute control. Life has always been movement, change, uncertainty, impermanence, and when the mind finally begins accepting this, a new kind of freedom starts appearing. Not the freedom of controlling everything, but the freedom of not needing to control everything. This freedom is extremely subtle. It does not appear as a dramatic revelation. It appears as lightness, a lightness in how you respond to situations, a lightness in how you observe thoughts, a lightness in how you allow life to unfold. And the more this lightness grows, the more that strange peace begins deepening. A peace that does not depend on perfect circumstances, a peace that does not depend on final answers, a peace that appears when the mind finally begins to rest. Rest from the need to fight, rest from the need to predict, rest from the need to correct reality. And when the mind begins resting in this way, something beautiful begins to unfold. You start noticing aspects of life that were previously invisible. The silence between sounds, the presence within simple moments, the depth hidden inside ordinary experiences. It is as if life had always been quietly extraordinary, but the mind was too busy fighting to notice. And when that struggle begins dissolving, life starts revealing something that had always been there. A natural tranquility, a tranquility that does not need to be manufactured, a tranquility that does not need to be searched for. It simply appears. When the mind stops fighting what is already happening. But at this point in the journey, a new realization begins emerging. And this realization may be even more transformative, because when the mind stops fighting, you begin noticing something that once seemed invisible, that behind thoughts, behind emotions, behind the mind itself, there is something that has always been observing. And discovering what that observer is may completely change how you understand consciousness itself. As this new relationship with the mind begins to deepen, something even more surprising begins to unfold. You start noticing that there is a difference between thoughts and awareness. Before awakening, this difference is rarely perceived, because the mind appears to be everything. Thoughts appear to be who you are, emotions appear to define your identity, the stories your mind tells appear to define your reality. But when inner silence begins emerging, a very subtle perception begins to appear. You start realizing that thoughts come and go, they arise, they disappear, they change, they transform. But something within you remains. Something that does not change with every thought. Something that does not disappear when a thought ends. Something that remains present, even when the mind becomes completely silent. And as this perception begins becoming clearer, a deep question naturally arises. If thoughts come and go, who is noticing those thoughts? This question may appear simple, but it carries transformative power. Because when you begin looking at this question carefully, you start noticing something extraordinary. There is a space within you that is not a thought, a space that observes thoughts, a space that perceives emotions, a space that witnesses experiences. This space is silent, but it is incredibly alive. It does not react the same way the mind reacts. It does not need to fight reality. It does not need to control every situation. It simply observes. And when you begin noticing this space, something inside you begins relaxing even more deeply, because you realize you no longer need to identify completely with every thought that appears. You realize that thoughts are events, mental events. They appear in consciousness, just as clouds appear in the sky. They are not permanent. They do not define who you are. They are simply temporary movements within the mind. This realization completely transforms how you experience your own thoughts. Before, a negative thought could dominate your entire experience. Before, a worry could consume hours or days of your energy. Before, an intense emotion could feel impossible to observe without being carried away by it. But when you begin recognizing this space of awareness, something changes. Thoughts still appear, but they no longer have the same power. They arise, but they no longer control the experience. They appear, but they no longer define your identity. They pass, and in the space left between them, silence becomes clearer. This silence is not empty. In fact, it is incredibly full of presence, full of perception, full of awareness. And when you begin living more from that space, something very interesting happens. Life begins feeling simpler, not because challenges disappear, but because the mind is no longer reacting in the same way. Situations that once felt threatening now appear as experiences. Thoughts that once felt like absolute truths now appear as temporary interpretations. And emotions that once felt overwhelming can now be observed with a new quality of attention. This shift creates something extremely valuable. Inner freedom, not the freedom of controlling life, but the freedom of experiencing life without being constantly trapped in the movements of the mind. This freedom is incredibly silent. It does not require recognition. It does not require validation. It simply exists. When you realize you are not every thought appearing in the mind, you are the space that perceives those thoughts. And when that realization deepens, a new dimension of human experience begins revealing itself. A dimension where silence is no longer absence, but presence. A presence that was always there, but rarely noticed, because the mind was too busy fighting. But now, as that struggle begins dissolving, something new begins emerging, an inner stability, a stability that does not depend on circumstances, a stability that does not depend on approval, a stability that does not depend on controlling the future. This stability arises from the simple recognition of something fundamental, that you are not only the mind, you are also the awareness that observes the mind. And when this realization begins maturing, peace stops being just a moment. It begins becoming a state, a silent state, a natural state, a state that was always available, but that only reveals itself when the mind finally stops fighting. And as this peace begins stabilizing, something even more interesting begins appearing. A new way of living. A way of living where the mind continues existing, but no longer dominates the experience. A way of living where thoughts still appear, but no longer create the same level of conflict. A way of living where awareness becomes the center of experience. And when that happens, life begins revealing itself in a completely different way. More silent, more profound, more real. But this discovery also raises an important question. If you are not your thoughts, if you are not only your mind, then who are you really? And that question opens the door to the next stage of the journey. A stage where the very idea of identity begins transforming. If you made it this far, something inside you may have recognized this experience. Maybe you were not just watching this video, maybe you were seeing yourself in it. Because what we explored here is not just a philosophical idea. It is something that begins happening when awareness starts awakening to itself. For most of our lives, the mind believes it must fight everything. Fight thoughts, fight emotions, fight reality, fight time, fight the future, fight to become something, fight to avoid something. And that constant struggle creates an inner weight, a silent tension, a feeling that peace is always somewhere in the future, but never here. But when something inside you begins to awaken, a new possibility begins appearing. The possibility of not fighting every experience, the possibility of observing the mind, without believing everything it says, the possibility of realizing that thoughts are simply temporary movements of the mind, and that behind those movements, there is something far more silent, far more stable, far more profound. Awareness. And when you begin recognizing this awareness, life starts changing in a very subtle way. Externally, nothing may change immediately. Your job may remain the same. The people around you may remain the same. Life's challenges may still exist. But the way you experience everything begins transforming. Because now there is space. Space between thought and reaction. Space between emotion and response. Space between experience and interpretation. And inside that space, something new begins emerging. Clarity. A clarity that does not depend on ready-made answers. A clarity that arises simply from observing, from noticing, from being present. And as that clarity grows, the mind begins calming down. Not because you forced it to stop, but because it realizes it no longer needs to fight constantly. And from that calm, something begins emerging that many people describe as a strange peace. A quiet peace. A peace that has no logical explanation. A peace that does not depend on external circumstances. This peace begins small, almost imperceptibly. But when you begin recognizing it, it starts growing. It starts becoming more frequent, more natural, more stable. And that is exactly what we will explore in the next video. Because when the mind truly stops fighting, something very interesting happens. A different kind of calm begins appearing. A calm that is not created by the mind. A calm that was always present, but hidden behind the constant noise of thinking. In the next episode, we will explore this deeply. The calm that appears when the mind stops fighting. You will begin noticing how this peace appears in real life, how it manifests in everyday experiences, and why this calm is one of the clearest signs of emotional maturity and awakened awareness. If this video resonated with you, share it with someone who may be going through this phase. Sometimes one reflection can bring clarity to years of inner confusion. And before you leave, write one word in the comments that represents where you are right now. Just one word. Silence, clarity, transition, awareness, calm, awakening. When you write that word, you recognize your phase, and recognition strengthens awareness. Continue this journey. The next video is already waiting for you. Gratitude for being here. Much light on your path. Quantum silence.